know we all share the interest in not just COVID, but what are the strategies we put in place that lead to better resiliency against whatever comes next, and not just thinking about infectious diseases. What else can we do in our organizations?
With the rise in the variant, what are organizations doing now? Obviously, over time, they've been looking at keeping employees safe, but what are they doing now to keep employees safe? And what are employees doing themselves in terms of managing their own safety in the workplace?
Yeah, I think the last part of that question should be the easiest. Everyone needs to get vaccinated. I'm a big proponent of vaccine mandates. This is the path out of this. They're safe, they're highly effective. That's our long-term, big picture strategy here. We can talk about the other controls employees can do. In terms of what can companies do, I think everyone has to recognize that this is an airborne virus. That seems obvious, but it was not accepted for over a year by CDC, and even the World Health Organization hedges on this. We've been working with EY since day one. This is an airborne virus. I wrote a piece in February 2020 calling this. That is important because then that determines what controls flow from that. So what you can do as an organization, outside of the things you've heard about masking, vaccines, the buildings are key. So think about this just quickly. When we talk, breathe, sing, we're generating respiratory aerosols. If you're infectious, they will carry the virus. They will build up indoors in an underventilated space. In fact, they will travel beyond 6 feet. They'll accumulate until they're removed through one of two ways. They're brought out of the building through ventilation, or they're cleaned out of the air through filtration. So a lot of companies have gotten their act together on ventilation and filtration enhancements. But I say there's still companies right now I work with and advise that have just come on board that are just getting a handle on this. So it's better late than never. But as they think about the return to work, it's been pushed off a little bit through the fall. Maybe some firms think about the winter. There's still a lot of time to get your ventilation and filtration game in place. So I'll stop there. That's a lot, but I think that's absolutely key for organizations to take care of.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, I know you had mentioned when we talked earlier around employees and what they were doing to manage their own kind of monitoring of the ventilation. Is that something that organizations should be concerned about?
Well, absolutely. I think organizations not only have to put in these improvements, but you need to verify the performance. That's obvious. But how do you do it? And you can use real-time sensors to do this. And I'll tie it into your question, Sarah, because I think it's really sharp. That if you're not doing this, your employees will be doing it. And I'll give you an example. I am measuring carbon dioxide on my desk right now. That is way too high. I would never have people over here. 2,000 parts per million of CO2 is too high. I'm going to pop up my window, but it's very humid out today. There are tools available. This doesn't cost a couple $100. And if you've seen what's happening in social media, a lot of people are using these and shaming organizations. Hey, Delta, I'm on your plane. It's 2,000 parts per million. I've heard from Professor Allen, that's not safe. Hey, so-and-so store, I'm in your store. Look what's happening. So it's flipped, right? It's a citizen science moment. A lot of people are monitoring CO2 as a proxy for ventilation rate. And so I think it's a smart move for organizations to think about or to deploy a real-time monitoring network so that you can not control the data, but you can be on top of it. You're presented with something, you can combat it. Well, people are misusing these things all the time. I can game this thing, I can blow into it and I get this thing up way too high. And so you can actually control the data in a good way and then control the messaging and importantly, most importantly, be reassured that what you're doing is working. And I'll explain it just a little bit that the current standards that are set for buildings are minimum standards designed for infection control. And if you're meeting those, it'll be about 1,000 parts per million. So most offices, you see about 1,000 parts per million. Most schools, 1,500 parts per million. On an airplane, I've measured it over 2,000 parts per million. My office, way too high. So that's been the rule of thumb. That's not enough. The current rule of thumb I've seen out there, and I've derived this from some of the work we've done, under 800 parts per million would be good. But there's a major caveat, if we're gonna get into the details of sensing. Remember, as these aerosols, respiratory aerosols build up in the room, you have two mechanisms, ventilation or cleaning out of the air through filtration. The CO2 is telling you ventilation. And because filters don't capture CO2, most filters don't capture CO2, you could have a condition where you had high CO2, but people were still protected because your filtration game is great. So it's not an absolute. There's nuance here, but a rule of thumb is you want to look for probably under 800 parts per million. Under 1,000 prior to COVID had been the rule of thumb that a lot of people in my field used. I think the movement, though, this healthy buildings movement we're in, as I call it, is pulling way ahead because of the expectations of all of your employees and people in your companies, right? That this is the new minimum. Who's going to go into a building that's not healthy? You want a healthy building? How do you verify it? So to be proactive, I think it's smart to start thinking about what your monitoring program looks like in your buildings. Who is doing it? Do you have the technology in place? Even if you're not doing it today, guaranteed, these things are going to proliferate, right? You'll be doing this on your phone not too far off. So this future merging of smart buildings and healthy buildings is here to stay. Whether you do it this year or next year, you'll be doing it eventually in your companies. Here's something really important for board members, though, and directors to think about. Do you have the expertise in the company to deal with that data? Because it's now essentially health data. So many times this kind of monitoring data was energy data over the past 20 years, goes to facilities, maybe a sustainability manager, they can manage energy data fine. If they screw up the energy data, that's bad, but no one dies or gets sick in your building. If that's where the data are flowing, they have to have people in your organization who have that training, the health-based training, to know what to do with that data, to know when to sound the alarm, hey, there's a big problem here, or when it's acceptable and okay. I've been talking with a lot of companies. That's an area they're really taking seriously, because now you're generating data. If no one's looking at it, presents a future liability, it can be discovered, it's discoverable for a toxic tort claim. So that's, I think, a really key area. If you've collected data, who is monitoring it in your organization?
What trends and what considerations the board should have in terms of workspace and density I wonder also if there'll be eventually regulation on that as well.
Yeah, so it's a good question and obviously important. So distance matters. I think that's obvious. One way to think about the transmission factor is cigarette smoke. It's a nice way to visualize. If I'm smoking a cigarette, you're 2 feet from me, you're going to get a big blast. If you're 6 feet, a little bit less. If you're in a well-ventilated space or outdoors, you may not even notice I'm smoking at 10 feet away, right? So that's one way to visualize it. That said, I think it's a mistake to look at these different control strategies in isolation. When the other control strategies are in place, if you have a high percent of your people vaccinated, if you have good ventilation and filtration, distancing becomes less important. And what I've seen over the past year is that many organizations and even schools have started to pull back from the strict 6-foot distancing. I'm seeing a lot less of the tape everywhere. Everybody, measured off 6 feet at all times, one-way directional movement. I think that's done. I think rightly so. And it's based on the science. If you look at the meta-analyses that are done, when baseline risk is low, distance becomes much less important. So what defines baseline risk being low? Amount of community spread, what are the controls in your building, what percent of your people are vaccinated. And so I'd say most organizations I work with are no longer following any kind of distancing rules. This is everything from Broadway. They're going shoulder to shoulder. I've done performing arts all summer, touring concerts, TV shows we've advised. They're all shoulder to shoulder against schools, no distancing requirements. And most offices, airplanes, right, no distancing. So they've removed the middle seat thing that they did for a little bit. So anyway, I think that's consistent with how organizations are approaching it, but it's if you have those other controls in place. Yeah, so 2 great comments tying into climate, and I'll tie it into buildings and workspaces. So the short answer to the second question, I don't know of a great study that does that yet. I think it's coming because of the we've seen already, for example, studies starting to show the better air quality when fewer people are commuting. So those kind of studies are out there, and that ties into climate, ties into air pollution, ties into better health. So those kind of studies are coming. I haven't seen it tied directly to real estate footprint, but I think it's there. And to Amanda's comment and related on, how to think about the ESG responsibilities in the context of COVID and what else is coming in real estate portfolios, I will say this: we've done several studies here that are related to buildings and climate. Buildings consume 40% of global energy. And we put out a study a couple months ago, I think surprised a lot of people, that as the Grid has gotten cleaner in the US in many places. A lot of coal-fired power has been driven off. The dominant adverse health effects from our energy system right now are coming from buildings, on-site fossil fuel combustion. I think that's probably surprises a lot of people, but it's important for organizations because the attention will shift from when you think about ESG, say, oh, it's a grid problem, it's the coal-fired power plant problem. No, it's actually what's in your building. Are you burning fuel in your building that's contributing to localized health impacts? Very different from downstream. Oh, it's somewhere else where it's being combusted and released in the air. It's on site, and it becomes an equity thing. Where are these buildings sited? Who is having the health effects from the pollution emitted by your buildings? That's a really subtle shift. I don't think anybody's picked up on yet. A little bit. Our paper was just published a couple months ago, but it is going to shift in the next couple of years, the conversation and the focus on buildings. So to your point about, what do we think about climate, ESG, our whole building footprint anyway, it starts to feed into that same narrative. Are buildings are they polluters, or can you actually have a building that's healthy, it's green, doesn't burn fossil fuels, and then has a very low carbon footprint. And the footprint then becomes about your commute and cars and things like that.